Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you all for joining us here tonight. On behalf of all the 1,500 who are gathered here tonight, we'd like to thank Eva for coming all the way out here from London, England. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. You deserve every ounce of it, every little bit of it. All this honor is all for you. You're a true hero, Eva. We didn't get here tonight on our own, nor could have we. We would like to thank our sponsors tonight, the Fuss, the Zun Foundation, the Zun Family, Evergreen Bank, and Magullian Homes. Thank you so much for helping us make this a reality. And thank you for all our wonderful volunteers, starting with our lead volunteer coordinator, John Cornett, and all the, thank you. And the volunteers from the Phoenix High School, Talent, Middle School, and SOU Honorary Program. Thank you guys, have done a terrific job. As well, a special thank you to my dear wife, Faggy, who's here with us tonight, who behind the scenes, she pulled it all together after just having a baby 1 month ago. It was 1933 in Hanover, Germany. Was walking home when suddenly he was attacked and beaten up severely by Nazi youth. All because he was born a Jew. Luckily, he had the foresight to flee Germany. But my grandmother, Hinda, my sweet bubby, who would never hurt a fly, she didn't have a bad bone in her body. Her parents, her grandparents, and all 7 of her siblings were sent to Auschwitz, to the concentration camp, to the gas chambers. All because she was born a Jew. To comprehend, how could an entire society act with such evil and cruelty towards another human being? And we must never forget, so history does not repeat itself. But it's difficult to comprehend as well because we innately believe in the God-given rights for every human being to exist and to live in peace. The great rabbi of our generation, the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, taught us that if the force of evil, when unlashed, is so powerful, certainly the power of goodness is even stronger. Tonight we have with us Eva Schloss, who after everything, the misery she's gone through, has been able to channel all that suffering to becoming an ambassador for goodness and kindness. My hope is that tonight we all walk away with the greatest sense of urgency, of responding to the hate that exists in our society today with even a greater force of goodness until goodness will prevail on earth. I'd like to end off with a prayer of hope, a prayer that the Jews sang as they walked into the gas chambers. Ani ma'amin bi'amuna shalema bebiat HaMashiach sheyavo afapi sheyisamamea im koze achakalo, which means in English, I await the Messianic era when peace will reign and swords will be turned into plow shields. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And let us resolve never again to senseless hate, and always again to baseless and random acts of kindness. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
And second, why here? Why now? Why today?
Well, I got invited here to come, so this is why I'm here today. But I started to speak about 30 years ago. I was silent for over 40 years, but when I realized the world hasn't really learned, I realized one has to speak up. Many, many people were denying that the Holocaust ever happened, and as well, people said, well, yes, it wasn't so bad, and, try to minimize the effect and all that. The number of 6 million is highly exaggerated, and all those stories I heard, and I said, no, I have to tell my story. And this is what I'm here now to do, and we have to learn from the past. There is a saying, you have to learn from history, but there's also the saying, history repeat itself. So this last thing we don't want to believe. History shouldn't repeat itself. We learn from history, and that is why it is important, especially, of course, for young people, to learn the history of what had happened so that it will not be repeated.
I know you have children, you have grandchildren. They try to talk you out of this. I mean, you do live in London. You are in your 90s. This is a lot of work.
Yes, yes, my grandchildren, I must say, I've got 5 grandchildren. They're all very, very good people. They know my story, of course. With the grandchildren, it was easier to talk about it because so much has passed. With the children, and this is a problem as well now with many second-generation survivors, children from survivors, because the parents didn't talk to them. And perhaps it was a mistake of us not to talk to the children, but it is difficult to burden your own child with terrible experience that their mother or their father has gone through. So that's why most Holocaust survivors didn't share their story with their children, but they did with their grandchildren.
When we talked earlier, I kind of went over my questions, and you said, sequence, difficult.
That's right.
And I said, how about I ask no questions?
We have to go through the whole story. It's all important. You will see once we have gone through it, you couldn't just jump 3-4 years, because in all these years in the 30s and 40s, all those things happened, and you have to really recount the story as a whole.
So when you said that, I said, okay, I dump all my questions. Just tell us your story. And then you said, no, you have to ask some questions. So I'll start with, tell us about your childhood.
Well, we start with where I'm born, in Vienna, Austria, which still is a beautiful country with lots of mountains, a bit similar here, but lots of lakes as well. And I was born into a young family. My parents married when they were very young. My mother was 18, right out of school. My father was 21. They had a son a few years later. A few years later, I was born. We had grandparents living very near us, aunts, uncle, so idyllic upbringing. My parents were very devoted to each other and, of course, to their children. And yeah, it was lovely. We went in the summer, we went up in the mountains. In the winter, we went skiing. I grew up on skis. I liked the sport very much. And my brother was quite different. He was much more gentle. I should have been the boy and he's a girl. Um, when there was a fight, I was always attacking people. He was always protecting everybody. Um, but you know, this is how we were. And but my brother was a very clever young man. He read a lot of books, and he told me everything he read. So I thought, well, I don't have to learn to read. I get it all from my brother. And that is why I devoted much more time on sports. Yeah, and so life was very good, where we went to our parents every weekend, and well, it was just idyllic. But it didn't last very long, because in 1938, so I was just 9 years old, Hitler just marched into Austria. He didn't ask the government. There was supposed to be a plebiscite to ask if the people wanted to join up Germany, but they didn't ask. And one day in March 1938, the Nazis just marched in. We had many Christian friends, you know. So we were Jewish, but we didn't. You know, you didn't ask what religion you belong. You just made friends from school. And suddenly all our friends stood in the street with Heil Hitler salute and big swastika flags waving. And Jewish people who known already what had happened in Germany at the time were very, very scared. My brother, he was 12 years old at the time. The next day, he came home from school, and he looked terrible. His clothes were torn, blood was streaming from his face. And when my parents questioned him, he said, my own friends did that, and the teachers just watched it happening. I came home crying, and my mother said, what has happened? And my best friend was a Catholic girl that on the way home, I usually stopped off there, and we did some games and playing things. But again, the next day after Hitler marched in, the mother opened the door, and when she saw me, she looked with such hatred at me. And I went home crying, and my mother explained, obviously, they don't want to mix with Jewish refugees anymore. That was really a big shock for our system. We were lucky, and this was really the tragedy of the Holocaust. Never forget this, and this is why, again, I take up the plight of refugees. At that time, if the Jewish people could have found a home in anywhere in the world, they would have gladly left Austria and Germany, and later, of course, Czechoslovakia, Poland, because Hitler conquered the whole of Europe, and in all those countries, he persecuted the Jewish people. And the world, by 1938, it became very, very difficult to get a visa anywhere in the world. And that was Hitler realized nobody wants the Jews. The only way to get rid of them is to kill us.
Your friendship with Anne?
Pardon?
Your friendship with Anne?
Yes, well, we were lucky. We were able eventually to go to Amsterdam. Very lucky, very, very lucky. And we moved to a big open square. If ever you go to Amsterdam, it becomes, of course, a big visiting city now, mainly because of the Anne Frank house. But we moved onto a big open square, and when you live in apartments, was an apartment, of course you have no yard for children to play. So after school, all the local children from this neighborhood came out to play. There was big space. And one day a little girl came to me and introduced herself very politely. Her name was Otto Frank. We were both 11 years old, and we became friends. We played together, we skipped together. But through my experience in Austria and Belgium, I skipped this part because there's a lot to talk about. I had become withdrawn and shy, had difficulty with the language. So I looked up at Anne. She was a big chatterbox. Her nickname was Mrs. Quack Quack, because she never stopped talking. She had to stand behind in class to write 100 lines. I'm not going to talk so much in class, but she couldn't help it. Next week she had to stay behind as well. When I told her I had an older brother, she said, when can I come and meet him? Because already with 11 years old, she was quite a big flirt. For me, boys was quite natural. Boys came all the time in the house. But when I told her I had a brother, she said, oh, I only have a sister. You are so lucky. And I was lucky indeed, I must say. But so we became friends. And but what was quite interesting, I was at the local school, but she wasn't. She went to a Montessori school. Her sister didn't. She went to the ordinary school. But later, after I read the diary, I realized her father, Otto, must have realized that she's a bit different. She needs more attention. And so she went to the Montessori school. But she was only 4 years old when she settled in Amsterdam. So she spoke Dutch perfectly. She didn't even know German anymore. And Otto later told me very often that he left Germany, Frankfurt, where his family has lived since 1500. But he realized it is not a country where he wants to bring up his children, because there was a very famous Nazi song. It went like this: when Jewish blood drips from our knives, life is going to go good again. So he said when he heard this singing in the street by the Nazis, he realized this is a dangerous country for Jewish people. So they left. And we settled down in Amsterdam in this apartment. There was a piano, a furnished apartment, because you were not allowed to bring anything with you. And my brother had a wonderful ear. He could play anything. And so he played the piano and I danced and we had fun. We were together as a family again. So things looked very good. But unfortunately, it didn't last very long, because in May, so after we had been there 3 months, the Nazis invaded Holland. And there was a very short war, 5 days, and the Germans, and this is different from the First World War, the Germans bombarded Rotterdam, the second biggest city, and with 10,000 casualties. And Nazis said, if you're not capitulating, we are going to bomb all your cities. The other bad thing was that the royal family was very much beloved, actually. There had been a royalty for many, many, many years, from 1500 actually, the same family. And they escaped, first to England and later to Canada. And that was very discouraging, of course, for people who are trying to fight the independence. But you know, it was such a dangerous time and so unexpected that you had to make quick choices. The Nazis invaded Belgium after Holland, and the Belgian king decided he would stay and work together with the Nazis so he might help his own people. After the war, he had to abdicate it because he said he was a traitor. So, you know, every decision was difficult. You want to ask me something else about?
You can interrupt me at any time. When you were in hiding, your own personal memories, and then also what you observed of your family as you went through those painful times, and how long were you in hiding?
We went, well, yes, but I must still, you missed out a little bit, something important. You know, we were occupied by the Nazis, and at first nothing really happened, but slowly measures against Jewish people started to appear. We were not allowed on public transport. Then we had to hand in our bicycle. Then we were not allowed to go to cinemas or sport activities or theaters. Then we were not allowed to go shopping in Christian shops. Then we had to wear the yellow star. So it became each time more dangerous. When we wore the star, people disappeared. You know, if a young man was walking in the street and he looked at a Nazi, the Nazi could just take him away and he would never see him again. If he didn't look at him, he could disappear because the Nazi said, you. So many, especially young men, disappeared, were never ever heard again. And then we had to leave our schools and had to go to Jewish schools. By itself, that is perfectly all right. But what happened, the Nazis wanted to get the young people first. So they went to those schools with trucks, told in different classrooms, there's a truck downstairs, you have to go in there. The children, of course, did obey. And in the evenings, the parents waited for the children to come home, and they didn't turn up. So they went to the local police, then they went even to the Nazi police, didn't get an answer. So children were never ever seen again. After the war, we heard that they were sent to Mauthausen, an Austrian death camp where there were high cliffs, stone quarries, and they were just thrown down from the cliffs. So you can imagine the situation became really very, very tense and scary. So after 2 years occupation in 1942, 10,000 young people, including my brother, who was 16, and Anne's older sister, Margot, 16 years old as well, a call-up notice to appear within a week to a certain place to be deported to Germany. Well, why should the Nazis suddenly invite Jewish people to come back to Germany? So many parents decided they wouldn't send their children. So my father called us together and he said, Heinz, you are not going, but we are going into hiding. Well, I was 13 years old. I said, what do you mean hiding? Adults don't hide. And he explained he has found some wonderful people who were helping Jewish people to keep us safe. So, but he couldn't find a home who was going to take 4 people, so we have to split up. And I will go with my mother and Heinz will go with him. And I started to cry because I didn't want to be separated. And my father explained, if we are in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. Survive. So I think with 13, this was the first time that I became really scared that it might be a matter of life and death, which it was, of course. And so we went into hiding with wonderful people who risked their own life to keep us safe. And we were perhaps in 2 years we were in hiding till 1944. And we were perhaps in 7 different places. because the Nazis knew that not all those youngsters had turned up, and they really wanted to catch every Jew. So they made house searches. So at night was a knock on the door. People had to open the door, even Dutch non-Jews, and had to let them in and search their homes. So in every place we were, we had a hiding place within the hiding place. So the people from the resistance, those people, those good people, came to the apartment, looked it over, and then they made false partitions, sometimes even under the floorboards. And when the knock came, we quickly went there. But you know, people, the people who hid us became nervous. They said, we can't sleep anymore. We are waiting for this knock on the door. And then when they search our home, perhaps they will find you. And those people, of course, were arrested as well. So it became very, very difficult to find new hiding places because people were arrested and people were scared. And after 2 years in hiding, my father was in the country with Heinz, staying with a lady, and he phoned my mother, that's the way we were in touch, and said, this woman was in. He said, if we have no more money, she's going to throw us out anyway. So can you please find a hiding place for us in Amsterdam? And my mother was in touch with the resistance people, and eventually a Dutch nurse came forward and said she knows a safe house. But as it turned out, she was a double agent. She really worked for the Nazis. So, and I was so miserable not seeing my father and brother. The day they left on moving to this new place on a Sunday, my mother and my father decided we could go and visit them, which we did. And Tuesday was my 15th birthday, May 11, and we sat down to breakfast, and there was a knock on the door, and the Nazis stormed in and went straight for my mother and me and took us away. So you can imagine my 15th birthday, something I'll never ever forget, because this was really the end of our, well, of part of my life.
Would you like a sip of water?
No, thank you, that's fine.
And next.
Yeah, so we were arrested, and I was interrogated, and I must say I was in such a shock that they couldn't get any word out of me, which was of course not very good, because they started to beat me and to threaten that they would kill my brother. And that was really the first time that I realized we were all for court. How it happened, I didn't realize, of course, at first. But then later, when we were again reunited together, my father explained that the Nazis came in with their own keys and talked with his nurse. So obviously she was a friend of the Nazis. But just to tell you what kind of persons those were who betrayed people knowing they might meet death. She had her boyfriend was a member of the resistance. And in this house, actually, there were 200 people betrayed because her boyfriend, who worked for the resistance, he always came to her and said, I've got a child who needs a hiding place. Have you got a safe house? Yes, sure, I have it. Well, can you go and visit these people and give them the letter? No, no, you can't. So she became suspicious of her own boyfriend and betrayed him, and he was shot. So those people had no scruples who they betrayed. And after the war, my mother was actually at a court case. She only got 4 years for having betrayed more than 200 people, sent them to their death. So this was for us, of course, the worst thing, to be caught after 2 years trying to stay safe.
How many families do you know that you actually stayed with?
Stayed where?
How many families did you stay with during that whole time?
I think about 7 different families, yeah. But now we were taken, after they realized they couldn't get anything out of me, we were taken to a holding camp. It was called Westerbork, was about 3 hours train ride. This was still in proper ordinary trains. And this Westerbork was a big camp which was actually run by Jewish people with the supervision of the Nazis. But what happened, the Nazi commandant said to the Jewish head of the camp, I need on Friday a list of 800 people to be sent to the east. Meaning being sent to the east meant in 85% certain death. So you can imagine this man has to make a list knowing he will send those people to their death. Terrible, terrible decision to be made. But as we had just arrived there, we didn't have any contact yet. You know, if you knew somebody, you could avoid to be put on the list. But we were not. We didn't know anybody so quickly, and we were put on the list the next Friday. And you might have seen the transportation to the camps were not in ordinary trains, but you can call it cattle truck for animals, or even a container. It looked really like a container where you see now where goods are being transported from America to China and from China to Europe and so on. Metal, just a little slit for air with a barbed wire across. There were just the floorboards, nowhere to sit. There was no room anyway. About 80 people pushed in. There were 2 buckets put in, one for clean water to drink for 80 people, and the other one to use as toilet, an open bucket. Once a day, big chunks of bread were thrown in like you feed wild animals. The only good thing was that it was the last time really that we were together as a family. And my father, with tears in his eyes, apologized to us that from now on he can't protect us anymore. And that must have been, for a head of a family, a terrible thing. Can you imagine that you can't look after your own family anymore? And my brother, again, more or less the last conversation I had with him, I just will tell you a little bit about him. As I told you, he was a musician really, but in hiding, of course. He couldn't play anything. He had to be very, very quiet. And he tried to occupy himself, like Anne wrote her diary. He started to paint. And he created some amazing artwork. And as well, he wrote wonderful, wonderful poetry. And he told himself 6 languages. And he told me all this very, very proud. And he said, but before they ran away from this house where the woman was blackmailing him, he hid it under the floorboard with a note on it. This belonged to Heinz and Erich Geiringer, and after the war, we are going to pick it up again. And he told me this, and he said, you'll be amazed what I have achieved. He was very, very proud of his artwork. You have seen a few things now.
He was incredibly talented.
He was really very, very talented. And, you know, he didn't see anything. He was not even allowed to look out of the window. So it was all just fantasy. And so, terrible journey. People fainted. It was messy. We were hungry. We were sweating. We were shaking from fear. Eventually, the train stopped, and we heard dogs barking and shoutings, and the doors were slit open. It was a beautiful May day, and we saw that we were in Auschwitz.
You were 15?
In Auschwitz was a worst camp, and we knew what it was because the BBC, the British Broadcast Corporation, said broadcast out to all the occupied country. By that time, actually, the whole of Europe was occupied by the Nazis. And in all those countries, the Nazis deported Jews, not just to Auschwitz. There were 300 concentration camp, death camps in Germany and Poland. And the BBC, besides telling how the war was going, always told about what is happening in those terrible, terrible death camps. And Auschwitz was always mentioned that Jewish people were systematically being gassed. So arriving at Auschwitz, you can imagine how we felt. So the next command was men and women to different sides. If ever you have been to those camps, or perhaps you might go one day, it was a huge, huge area of many, many, many miles, and there were many camps. Auschwitz was the biggest, and the name is the best known. That was a men camp, actually. And the women's camp was called Birkenau. And then there was a work camp, which was called Monoway, and then there were some other smaller camps. But for instance, the poisonous gas, Cyclone B, was even manufactured in Auschwitz by inmates. So first, the terrible thing was that you had to say goodbye to your menfolk. You can imagine mothers and sons and husband and wife and fathers and daughters cling to each other, didn't want to let go. I remember my father was not a very religious man, but he took me by the hands, looked at me so sad, and said, "God will protect you." He couldn't protect me anymore, but he gave me over to God. And then the man walked away to Auschwitz because this transport had started in Birkenau, actually. And then there were big whispers, Mengele, Mengele is coming. Everybody looked very scared. There were a lot of inmates standing around there. And Mengele, you might have heard his name, was a camp doctor. A youngish man, 40 years old perhaps, but not looking after people as a medical doctor, but to decide who was going to live and who was going to die. So the first selection was taking place, meaning you had to stand in rows of five people in a row, and then big queue, and he looked you over, fraction of a second, he decided if you would live or die. Now the first miracle happened. I was just in the dress I'd been arrested in, but my mother had given in the holding camp, somebody, a kind person, had given her a hat and coat. And my mother gave me this hat and coat to wear. I didn't want it because it was hot, but my mother said, well, perhaps it comes in handy later. You know, we really thought there wouldn't be any later, but you don't admit that. So I did put it on. And this hat had a big rim, and so when Mengele looked at me, he didn't really see how young I was. So I was just 15, and there were even girls of 16 and 17, if they were small or pale after this terrible journey, went to the wrong side. There were no children in Auschwitz. All the children, if a woman had a toddler on her arm, she had to hand it over to an older woman, and the mother wanted to run after them. No, this woman will take your child, which was of course terrible. And then after we lost about half our Dutch transport, and then we were herded into a big, big barrack, and the next command was undressed completely naked, and the Nazis were laughing at our embarrassment and poking with their gun at us. And then we had to parade in front of big tables where people were sitting making notes, and we had to give all information from which country we came, what age we were, what name we had, all kind of things they asked. And then they said, well, forget you have a name, you are going to get a number on your arm, you're going to be tattooed, and if ever we want you, we are going to call you out by your number. So this is what happened. We all had to put our hand in front, and they put a name on there, a number on that. The next thing was all our hair was shaved, and while this was going on, with much laughter and pushing each other, those Nazis told the family you had been separated from, and then they laughed again loud. They were going to a shower, but of course it wasn't a shower, it was gas. So you can imagine how people felt who had just been separated from their family. And after this, we were herded out. Everything was quick, outside, still naked. And there were two huge heaps of clothes, one with all kind of garments. And we were thrown one garment, which could have been a winter coat, could even have been a night dress. And the next heap were shoes. We got two shoes, never, of course, a pair. Very often two right shoes or two left shoes or a boot and a sandal, and that was all the belongings we ever had. Not even a piece of underwear, not even a piece of toilet paper. And then again, everything was always very quick. We had to run into our barracks. You might have seen pictures in Birkenau. There were 3 high bunks, wide about 1.5 yards, and 8 people had to sleep there. It was like a cage. There was nothing in it, not a bit of straw, no pillow, no blanket. The only thing which was in it was lice and bed bugs. So within a week, we were already full with bites, and it's itchy, very itchy, which we stretched. So we were full of wounds which got infected. Washing was, you can forget about that. At every part of the camp, you know, there was a Lagerstraße, like this, the middle was a street, and on both sides were barracks. And at the very end of it, there were a barrack which was sort of toilet facilities and washing facilities. So you had to go perhaps 10 minutes to the toilets or to the washing. The washing, there was no water, so why bother to walk there? So you can imagine with a week we were filthy. We started to get diarrhea, typhus, cholera. Many people died even the first week already. So, and we were taken to work early in the morning. We got a little mug of liquid, and in the evening when we came home completely exhausted, we got a big chunk of bread. That was all we ever got to eat. So how long could you live on this? So, I can tell you lots of terrible things happening, but I just want to tell you one of the worst things that happened. After about well, 6 months, I don't know. It started to be cold. Perhaps it was October. We came out of a shower. Once a week, we went to a shower, and we were deloused. And coming out of the shower, there was Mengele, and a selection was taking place, which did happen from time to time. Because, you know, if you live with so little food, you became weak and were not really able to work anymore. And those people were, of course, killed. And like any mother would do, my mother had very often given me a bit of her bread ration. And she had become really very, very thin. So I had to turn around in front of Mengele, and I went to the good side. And when my mother followed, he looked at her over twice, and then he put her with 40 other women from our Dutch transport to the wrong side. I still tried to run to her to say goodbye to her, but somebody beat me with a big stick over the back and separated us. So not even goodbye I could say to my mother. And then those naked women walked out, and I thought my mother was going to be killed. Can you imagine? Yeah. But the Russians were obviously approaching, and the Germans evacuated the camp. They took every day, many barracks were emptied, and people walked away with the Nazis. Of course, we didn't know where they were going or if they were going to be killed. And I was in a very bad state. I had frostbite on my feet. It was winter. Sometimes I lost my shoes in the snow. We were not allowed to pick it up. So my toes were open wounds, started to get infected. I was starving. Many of the people I'd known had been evacuated. I felt very abandoned, very lonely. I was hungry, I was freezing. I thought, I don't think I can make it much longer. And one day I was working again, crying and thinking, I don't know how long I can stand it any longer. And a capo, those are the women who run the camp, Polish inmates, called me and said, somebody wants you outside. And so I went outside thinking, what now? You know, perhaps I'm going to be killed. And so reluctantly I crawled outside, sort of, and amazingly there stood my father with an SS man. And we fell into each other's arms and cried, and amazing. How, you know, how could he find me? How did he know where I was? And of course, the first question I asked him, where is Heinz? Is he okay? He said, yes. And the next question from my father was, where is Mutti? How is Mutti? My mom. And I burst into tears, and I said to my father, she has been gassed. And I saw this man in front. He didn't look too well anyway, but I saw him getting even paler, and tears were running down his eyes. And we hugged, and then he got his composure back. He said, hold on, you must hold on. Heinz is okay, we'll make it, and Mutti will protect us from above. I still saw him. I was still able to come twice, and then I never ever saw him anymore. And then, as I said, the Nazis realized the Russians were coming, and many SS people disappeared. They escaped, you know, I mean, they went to safety. The very gates between the different camps, A, B, C, D camp, I walked around, and there came a few women from our Dutch transport who had been in another part of the camp, and they said to me, "Oh, good thing I see you, because I have wonderful news. We have seen your mother." Of course, I didn't want to believe it. I thought they just want to cheer me up. And I said, "No, that can't be true. She has been gassed." Said, "No, no, no, we have seen her. And she's there and there in this part of the camp. See if you can get there." And eventually I was able to get there, and indeed my mother was there. This was, of course, as you can imagine, wonderful, a miracle. And then again the Russians went nearer and nearer, and one morning, and I stayed there then with my mother. And then one day we woke up in the morning, and it was very, very quiet, no dog barking, no shouting. And we went outside, and the camp was deserted. The Nazis had fled. And so in this period, we were about 10 days on our own. Still many, many people died because, you know, it was freezing cold. There was practically no food. And yeah, it was just, you know, and we couldn't, of course, bury them. This was one of the most horrible things I had to do with another Polish woman. I was still more or less one of the stronger ones. We had to take out the dead bodies, and we couldn't bury them. We had to just heap them up behind the barracks. It was snow, there were ice, we had no shovels, we couldn't do anything. This was really, for me, I had many, many nightmares after that. You know, the day before I spoke with a person, and the next day they were gone. So we were about 10 days on our own till the Russians came to liberate the camp. You can imagine it was a great joy, of course. And the Russians came with field kitchens and stayed the night and cooked the first meal we have had, hot some cabbage soup. The smell nearly drove us mad while it was still cooking. And they gave us big metal bowls that we just ate and ate and ate and ate. But I've never had such a painful night on a bucket because the food ran right through me. And we realized how careful we were. And certainly not too much. And then the Russians went again to pursuing the Nazis. And I decided then with a French girl to go to Auschwitz to try if I could find my father and brother. So we went there, very difficult because they were fighting, bullets were flying over our heads. So at night we crept through the snow. It took me 6 hours. And we got there, and the Russian had made sort of headquarters there. And so we went into all the barracks and looked everywhere. There were as well about 500 men left. And I saw one man who looked slightly familiar, but he looked very thin and ashen color. And so I went to him and I said, "Do I know you?" And he said, "Yes, I'm Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank." And he asked, "Have you seen my girls or my wife?" I said, "No, I never saw them." "Have you seen my father or my brother?" Yes, I'd seen them, but they went a couple of weeks ago with the Nazis. So I thought, well, the chance that they'll be alive is big. They're there. Probably the war will end soon, and we'll be reunited again. But of course, the war wasn't ending that quickly. That was actually the liberation of Auschwitz, 27th of January, which is this year, will be the 75th anniversary. And I know in England there's going to be a very, very special memorial service and all kind of special things happening this year or next year, January. And the Russians realized that the Germans might come back again because in Poland the fighting was very, very fierce, because you know that the Germans didn't want the Russians to come into Germany. So Poland was a border country. They hoped they would keep the Russians away from Germany. But of course they didn't. They did go into Germany eventually. But it still took 4 months till May. So the Russians decided they wouldn't leave us in Auschwitz, which was actually very, very nice, because they still had to fight quite a heavy, heavy war. But they took us away and traveled eastward, deep into Poland, deep into Russia, and the troops went the other direction. So it took a long, long time. So we arrived in Odessa, which is the Ukraine now, but at the time it was still Russia, and the Black Sea, and there we waited for the end of the war. And that came, of course, in May, 8th of May. The Germans capitulated, and the war was finished. So we had a big party in Russia at the time, and then we wanted to go. There was thousands of people, many, many other camps, not just Auschwitz had been liberated, and as well many prisoners of war from all Europe and from Australia. There were lots of Australians there as well. And we all, of course, were very anxious to go back again to our own home. And eventually a New Zealand troop transport ship came and brought us back to where we wanted to go. Well, it stopped in all different ports, and Italians and French people, and so all got off. And eventually in June, so we traveled from end of January till June, we were on the road and on a ship as well, of course. That we had survived nothing. And we were quite shocked, you know, we had nothing still. I had a little backpack my mother had sewed for me. And we had, nothing really, and no money, anything. And then we heard what had happened. You know, all the other occupied countries were liberated already early when the Allied, the Americans and the British liberated France, Belgium, Denmark, Norway, Greece, was all liberated. But the Dutch were occupied by the Nazis till the end of the war, and they took every food the Dutch produced to Germany to feed their own people. And in Holland it was called the hunger winter. There were no dogs and cats. They all had been eaten. A person went to the farm, came home with 1 potato to feed a family of 5. There was literally no food left in this country. And people went into an apartment and they found 5 dead bodies there. So, and then more refugees came from Germany, we came through France. Everyday transport came people who needed looking after, who needed a home, who needed clothing, and that just wasn't there. So it was really, really very, very difficult to try to come to any normality. But I told you our apartment was furnished, belonging to a Christian, and she let us get in again. So this was one really very positive thing. But Otto Frank, he had nowhere to go, and he stayed with Miep Gies. She was one of the helpers, the 4 helpers who looked after them where they were in hiding. And then we went to the train station. We put adverts in the paper. We went around to ask people, have you seen this person? Have you met person? Where were you? And so on. And then Otto Frank met people who were in the camp where Anne and Margot perished in Bergen-Belsen. And they told him Otto had lost his children. And he heard as well he had lost his wife. When he came to tell us, he was 57 years old at the time, and he looked like a ghost. And my mother said, how can this man carry on with his life? And then we got a letter from the Red Cross as well, telling us, with the birth date, with the proper name, telling us that both my father and my brother had perished in Mauthausen, which was this terrible Austrian death camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. This was for us the last straw. Especially I had really assumed my father and brother would certainly come back again. But when I realized they would never ever come back, I became extremely depressed and as well starting to hate the whole world. To any normality. Then Otto Frank came and he had a little parcel under his arm and he opened it very, very carefully and he said, I have to show you something. And he opened it as if it was, the most precious thing in the world, which it was, of course, for him. And it was Anne's diary. And he said, can I read something to you? And he opened it and he read a few lines, but he always burst into tears. It was too emotional for him. It took him 3 weeks to read it. And then I said to my mother, we have to go and get those paintings of heads who were hidden under the floorboards in this house where the woman betrayed them, really. So we did, and indeed we found over 30 paintings and a whole lot of poetry, and this was what we had left from my brother. So, and to make a life again, that was really, really, really very difficult. And, I also told my mother, I was 16 by then, I have to go back to school, which I didn't want to. I felt I was an adult. Why should I go and sit with those kids? But Otto said to my mother, you have to see that she goes back to school because an education is the best thing you can give her along in life. So I went back to school, but I didn't enjoy it. When they had a party, I never went. I didn't want to enjoy myself. So it was really very, very tough. And when I finished, I did first a course at the university in art, but I didn't have the patience to sit. And then Otto and my mother decided I should become a photographer. And I didn't really care. If we would have said anything else, I would have said okay. But I was still very miserable in Amsterdam, and Otto knew somebody in London who had a photographic studio, and he got me a job there as an apprentice. So I went to London in 1951, and I lived in a little boarding house where there was a young man who had come from Israel to study economics. I told him I was Dutch, which I wasn't. I was actually stateless. He told me he was an Israeli, which he wasn't. He was a German refugee. And we didn't tell what our life was. We just told about what we had done in daytime and so on, or what we want to do perhaps in the future. And, but we got on well and we liked each other. And after 6 months he said to me, Eva, I've fallen in love with you. Will you marry me? And when I've finished my studies, we can start a new life and go to Israel. And I said, no, thank you. And he was a little bit upset, but he thought, well, perhaps later I might change my mind. And then Otto Frank came over one day, and he kept a bit an eye on me. And I told him this young man had asked me to marry him, but of course I was very, very close to my mother, as you can well understand. I would never have just deserted her. And I told him that, this young man has asked me to marry him, but of course I'm not doing that. I'm going back to Amsterdam after a year. And then he became a little bit embarrassed and said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love as well. And once you get married, we like to get married as well. So I went back to this young man and said, you can marry me now, which we did. And we were married for 63 years. Unfortunately, I lost him 3 years ago. But we had 3 children and 5 grandchildren, so we built up a very nice family again. So when I tell that to children in class sometimes, that I was married 63 years, they say, "Miss, how many husbands?" And I say, no, just one husband, which they can't believe always. And I didn't speak not to my family, not to my children, not to my husband, and only in 1986, when an Otto Frank exhibition came to England, and I was asked to attend. I was put on a podium with many other speakers, and I had never spoken about Holocaust. I was actually very, very shy. And then at the end, when everybody had spoken, the organizer said, and now Eva will want to say something to you. Well, I really wanted to hide under the table, but of course I couldn't do that. So I got up and looked at this audience, not quite as big as this, but still, and I had no idea what to say. That was all in my head, but not ready to tell. But eventually, obviously, the gate broke open and I just couldn't be stopped anymore. And this was for me a very, very important moment, because first of all, I realized that people want to know, that it is interesting. They really hadn't known much. By that time, there were not many books out about the Holocaust, nor films, and people were really interested to know, because again, terrible things had happened in the world. There was Cambodia, then the Vietnamese War, the Korean War, and the persecution even in Europe, Bosnia. And it was necessary to tell people that we have to change the world. So this is my story in a nutshell. There's of course much, much more. And then people told me, you have such an interesting story, you should write a book about it. And this is my first book, Eva's Story, which is available here. And what I've told you is really only a very, very, very small proportion. I told you about a couple of miracles, but there are many more miracles who happened. And this is why I'm able to sit here. So you've been a wonderful audience. Thank you very, very much. And I think we'll have some more questions. Thank you, thank you.
Eva, in a minute, we will introduce CEO and publisher of Rosebud Media, Mr. Steve Zaslow, who will be presenting the questions from the audience. But I want to say thank you from the bottom of our hearts. You are incredible on so many levels. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
Steve, it's all yours.
Oh, it's all mine. Okay, hello. We got a chance to talk for a few minutes, and I think I scared you when I said there were 18 questions. And you said, no, I'm not answering.
I know.
I don't think you scared
But
her at all.
what I promised was just a few. So what I want to do, if it's okay, is read what I read to you when we were sitting down. This is an excerpt from one of the books. This has to do with the Auschwitz Memorial. You and Zvi get to go back there, and this is what was written. Sorry. Later, I watched the memorial ceremony on television, and I heard Elie Wiesel say, "Although we know that God is merciful, please, God, do not have mercy for those people who created this place." Wiesel survived Auschwitz to become a writer and a Nobel laureate, and I agreed wholeheartedly with his next comment. Remember the nocturnal procession of children, of more children and more children, so frightened, so quiet, so beautiful. He said, if we could simply look at one, our heart would break. But it did not break the hearts of the murderers. Then I saw the world leaders laying wreaths and making remarks about how such things could never be allowed to happen again. But it has happened again. This is what Zvi had said. So I question, and I am summarizing but not repeating some of the things that you had covered, is you had written that there's an evil streak in people, and yet you have hope, and you're able to go forward. And what do we do for the next generations, those people 14 and up? And luckily in this state we now have teaching the Holocaust as part of the curriculum, as part of world history. Talk about the future, talk about the importance of going forward.
In most countries, Holocaust studies, teaching the Holocaust is compulsory. In America, unfortunately, it isn't yet. So this is something I think you should make it compulsory to teach that. I know even in the countries where it has been taught, there's still prejudice as well. But I think we have to give the people the choice how to behave. And if they know what has happened, they might choose a safer and better way to live. And this is really what we all aim for, not to have persecution, prejudice, and killing people in our own neighborhood, in our own surroundings. This is something I just can't comprehend, why we have the urge to harm other people. In Germany, it was one of the most educated, cultural people were able to do this without a moment of regret. This is still something we really can't understand. But again, you know, you have to really learn. His history is as well very, very important, because I'm not going to go into much detail, but it was the end of the First World War. Germany and Austria lost it, of course, and they got a terrible, terrible peace treaty, which made those countries starving, poverty, lost all their pride, and you know, and they wanted to revenge themselves. And Hitler was the man who said he was going to give them back the status of being proud and well-to-do people. And he succeeded. So, you know, it is all connected. So we have to learn from history, and of course, especially from the wars, why they happened, how they happened, and to avoid things like this happening again.
There are books on sale in the back. Thank you. You're very kind for coming and sharing with us.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Gone. He had prepared so many questions. The rabbi is back again. Thank you.
To say,
Thank
I
you.
just want to say thank you again. And the event is officially over now. There's books in the back of the room for anybody, limited amount of books, whoever wants to purchase.